Hello everyone, let's make a start on today's webinar. My name is David Kiernan and I'm a Curriculum Officer at NCFE. And this webinar is for Unit 1 of the Level 1 and Level 2 Technical Award in Interactive Media. I am joined today by Leslie Davis, one of our external quality assurers and a subject specialist in interactive media. You should all be able to access the slides that we're going to view today. On your control panel, there should be a section that says handouts. There you should be able to see a PDF version of these slides. Please do download and save them. So the plan for this webinar today is to first of all just give a brief overview of this qualification. We'll do a summary of the learning outcomes and the grading descriptors for Unit 1. That'll be Leslie Davis who will be going through that with you. We'll have a look at some example learner work, a Level 2 pass piece of work and a Level 2 distinction piece of work. And finally, to address any questions that you may have at the end. But at any point during this webinar, if you do have questions, please do ask them using the question box that you should see on your control panel as well. But first, I would like to begin just with a little poll about how confident you currently feel regarding the grading and assessing and so on of Unit 1 of Interactive Media, with 1 being little to no confidence and 9 to 10 very confident and so on. So please make your decision there. Okay, just over half the votes in, quite a bit. Looks like so far most of the votes, oh, it's quite a split now. Sorry, it just keeps changing. We've got all the votes in. Looks like it's a 29% 1 to 2, 29% 3 to 4, 29% 5 to 6, and 14% of people in the 7 to 8 range in terms of their confidence. Well, we'll see if we can get, especially those on 1 to 2, hopefully we can make you a bit more confident with regards to the assessing and grading of the Unit 1 work. So just going to begin, first of all, with an overview of this qualification. This is just going to be a very brief overview of how the qualification works. If you need something more comprehensive, if you're brand new to this qualification or brand new to these technical awards, then please do join or view one of our pre-recorded induction webinars that we have for the Level 1 and Level 2 technical awards. You don't have any audio working. Okay, sorry, that was a question that's just popped in. Good, the question is working. Can everyone else hear me okay? If you could just type into the question box if you can hear me. Yes. Yes, okay, audio is working. There may be something with your speakers, or do you have a set of headphones maybe that you can attach? It looks like everyone else is able to hear me, so it might be something on your end, unfortunately. So do see if you can get a set of headphones or speakers to connect in. I will say that this, a link to this will be sent out afterwards. I mean, if you can't hear me, you won't know that, unfortunately, but I'll type that answer in there at the minute. I'll just message you asking you to check your speakers. And a link to the recording will be sent out. My apologies, I just want to type this just to make sure that this person can hear me. Apologies to everyone else. Okay. Right, so a brief overview, as I was saying. So the Level 1 and Level 2 technical awards in interactive media, they consist of 2 key components: an external assessment, so an invigilated exam, which is worth 40% of the final grade, and the internally assessed coursework. Unit 1 is what we're going to be focusing on today, and overall the coursework is worth 60% of the final grade. And interactive media has got 4 units. They're all mandatory units, and each unit will be internally assessed with the coursework. So there are 4 internally assessed units. All of these 4 units, though, are also externally assessed. Content from those will appear on the invigilated external assessment. Learners are entitled to 1 resubmission of the internally assessed coursework once the EQA visit has occurred. And if your learners are doing the Level 2 qualification, do bear in mind that they will need to achieve a minimum of a Level 2 pass in each internal assessment and also a Level 2 pass in the external assessment. Learners as well are entitled to one resit of the external assessment as well. So one resubmission of the internally assessed units and also one resit of the external assessment as well. Now, the primary area that you will need for resources specification, assessment materials, regulations, and so much more is going to be QualHub, qualhub.co.uk. And in the search bar, once you go onto that website, you could just type in your subject area, your qualification code, interactive media, just type that in, or even just Level 2 technical award, and you'll get a list of those suggested qualifications. Now, there is quite a bit on there, different assessment materials, as I mentioned, the past exam papers, specification, we have teaching and learning materials as well. But one of the things, since we're just focusing on the assignment, the Unit 1 assignment, we have some ready to use assignments that you can use for the interactive media qualification, which are right there. There is an assignment for each of the internally assessed units, so we have 4 assignments ready for you to use. And you may wish to change aspects of the scenario so that it's more suitably contextualized for your learners. You can write your own assignments by all means, but if you need to have a look at something now, they're ready to use. And I'm going to have a look at one of these right now. And the first thing that you will notice on these assignments is that there is a scenario there, and this is all designed to give a real life situation to help set the assignment in context. After that, the assignment gives some further information about the specific information that the learners need to include in their assignment. Then there's information regarding how that could be presented, and we do try to keep that as open as possible to appeal to many different types of learners. And then we have the grading descriptors, and that's what the learners will need to know about. That's what the assessors are going to be grading and marking the assignment against as well. And when it does come to the grading, each unit does consist of 3 or 4 learning outcomes, and each learning outcome is to be graded. So there is 3 or 4 learning outcomes. So to get a pass in a unit overall, the learner needs to achieve a minimum of pass for each learning outcome. So if they get a pass in one outcome and then merits in the other 2 outcomes, their final grade is still a pass. So the final grade for a unit is going to be the lowest grade the learner achieved in a learning outcome. So there isn't any compensatory grading within a unit. There is at the end when it comes to combining all the units together, units 1, 2, 3, and 4, there's compensatory grading there. But with an individual unit, they all have to demonstrate that same basic level of competency for each learning outcome in order to say that the unit is at that overall grade 2. As I said, that is just a quick summary of this qualification. Just have a quick check for any questions. I don't see any at the minute. Hopefully your audio is working now and you can actually hear me. Hilary, I hope that is working for you. But in the meantime, I'm going to hand over now to Leslie, who's our EQA subject specialist in interactive media, who will talk a bit more specifically about the grading criteria and so on. So I'll just hand over to you now, Leslie.
Thanks, David. Hi, everybody. Welcome this afternoon. It's good to see so many of you have made it to the webinar. I hope you find this information useful for delivering assessment in your own centres. So welcome, everyone. Just a few things before I start to talk you through learning outcomes 1, 2, and 3 of Unit 1. Just a quick reminder that the PDF of this presentation is available within the handouts tab of this screen that you should be able to see. It's really useful to access at some point between now and before we finish. especially when we come to look at the samples of learner work at the end, because sometimes we not so much run out of time, but I tend to go through those quite quickly, just so we can get through an example of a pass and a distinction, because I'm aware that that's the part that many centres are really keen to see. So it's really important that that you take that PDF away that you can refer to in your own time. Another reminder is that you will get a link as well tomorrow on, I understand, of this presentation. So also you'll be able to refer back to any questions that have been covered today. So Unit 1, Investigate Interactive Media Production. Really important for centres to understand that it is an investigate unit. With new centres, new assessors, there's a little bit of misinterpretation. That learners have to produce a final product for this unit, and that's not the case. It's very much an introductory unit, and it's about learners investigating different features of interactive media products, some practical experimentation of their own, and then reviewing their own skills. So that's how the 3 learning outcomes are planned. So we've got learning outcome 1 is understand what is required for the development of a product. So this is where learners will look at different examples of interactive media products. Learning outcome 2 is where they actually do some practical experimentation of their own. And again, this doesn't have to be a final product. It could be a series of experimentation. So it might be just, for example, a one-page, a web page. It could also be the design of a mobile app. It could also be a 2D game. Anything really that's got interaction there is valid for learners to experiment with. And it doesn't have to be a final product. So they could experiment on different menus, to creating different assets, etc. And then learning outcome 3 is about reviewing the experimentation that they've undertaken in learning outcome 2. Sorry.
Going the wrong way there a little bit, Leslie.
Sorry.
There you go.
Oh, thank you. So the first what we'll look at is learning outcome 1. So the learner must know about the features of an interactive media product, target audience of an interactive media product, sources, and this is level 2 only, processes and techniques needed for the development of an interactive media product, and also the health and safety related to computer use. So for learners studying the learning level 1 qualification, the mandatory content here is features, target audience, and health and safety issues. And for those learners on level 2, they also must demonstrate their understanding of the sources, processes, and techniques. And it's up to centres really how they wish to deliver this content. You may want to split this into a series of formal lessons or practical workshops, or you may want to combine delivery with guest speakers or other relevant activities. And it's good practice to give learners examples of different products to review for this learning outcome, and that demonstrate different interactive features, as well as encouraging them to find their own examples. So that's quite common that teachers will provide a series of examples and then also allow some independent research for learners to bring in their own examples here. And when using the examples for review to provide the evidence, all mandatory content, such as the target audience, features, sources, processes, and techniques should be discussed. So these should be used as review prompts really within the learner's evidence. The health and safety element is often delivered separately, and this can be quite generic. However, it must be relevant to the issues related to computer use and relevant equipment to what your learners will be working with. And some examples are learners writing a health and safety report or creating a risk assessment for their upcoming work in this unit. Some learners have also created videos or animated slideshows, as this may be more engaging for them to create for that health and safety part. So once the unit content has been delivered, learners will then need to be set an internal assessment task to demonstrate their understanding of this learning outcome. And it's important to understand that learners must produce evidence for internal assessment in this learning outcome within the portfolio. So we would expect to see some examples of products, and a good way to demonstrate this is annotated screenshots to demonstrate learners' understanding of those 4 bullet points. And when we talk about assessment points, this is these bullet points in each learning outcome. So we also refer to these as assessment points. And then it's useful here to take a look at this information that's been taken directly from the specification. And it's really, these EGs really assist centres to sort of really explore what we mean here by features, target audiences, sources, processes, techniques and health and safety. So it gives you some examples here. And again, they are examples, so that it's not, all of these EG are not mandatory. So learners must know about the mandatory content, features, target audiences, sources, processes, techniques, health and safety. These EGs are just examples of how teachers may deliver that content. And then another good point here is regarding health and safety evidence. This actually, as mentioned before, it can be quite generic. It needs to be appropriate for the equipment that the learners are using. However, if they generated a risk assessment for this unit, because it's about looking at the equipment and processes that they're going to be used in their experimentation, the same risk assessment could also be used if it's relevant when they get to another unit, for example, Unit 3, where they have to create an interactive media product. So there is some overlap there with health and safety requirements. So please don't feel that you have to repeat, or the learners have to repeat the same health and safety task. If it's relevant and it meets the assessment criteria, it can be used more than once. So here we can see the Level 2 assessment criteria. It's good to mention here that the focus of the assessment is learners' understanding of what is required for the development of interactive media products. For example, the reviewing examples of products using those bullet and assessment points previously discussed. And it's a really good practice to use those as reference within their reviews. And again, just to reiterate, they don't need to create anything at this stage, as all the practical application is in Learning Outcome 2. So at PASS, learners need to describe each bullet point, each assessment point, and just to remember that there is slight difference between Level 1 learners and Level 2. For a merit, they also need to make some links. So in addition to the description of those assessment points, they also need to make some links between the bullet points. And for a distinction, they need to explain in some detail the links between those assessment points. So for example, for a merit, a learner might be reviewing a website or a web page, and they will need to, they might talk about the need to design and create buttons that link to different pages. And then to improve that for a distinction, a learner might explain why certain interactive features are appropriate for a specific age group, a target audience. For example, they might talk about a mobile application being suitable by the use of the colours or the particular design that might be targeted maybe to a particular group, such as 16 to 18-year-olds. So that's where they're starting to link. They're not, so they've still got the description. We're still in looking for description, even at pass, merit and distinction, but it's actually making those links between those key areas, between those features, target audiences, and those sources, process and techniques. And here we can see the level 1 assessment criteria, and quite basic evidence is required here. So the key descriptor here is identify. So identify is used at pass, merit and distinction for level 1. And at pass, they need to identify some obvious points, some relevant points for merit, and identify points with some explanation for a distinction. So we are looking for quite basic evidence here. So we might see bullet points, or we might see some lists from learners here who maybe haven't quite grasped, grasped a great deal of understanding, but they might be able to actually bullet point or some list some relevant points here. And we might see some incorrect use of subject terminology here as well. So that would be more representative for a level 1. But just to remind us here that for high level grade distinction, there must be some explanation. And again, this can just be a summary rather than a great amount of detail for level 1 distinction. And before we move on to learning outcomes 2, I'm just going to ask David if there's been any questions come in based on learning outcome 1.
Yes, we've had a few questions come in. One of the questions, I'm just going to wait till after you've done learning outcome 2, if that's all right, Sinead,
okay.
that you have asked about learning outcome 2. Might make more sense to ask it then. But there are some other questions. Sinead is asking, so can they make drafts of a website and then an app, or should they just focus on one type to fit the brief?
No, they can use a number. So I think the focus here is trying to give learners a broad understanding. And I know there's limitations, especially at the moment with what's happening with remote learning. But either way, what we're trying to do with learning outcome 1 is make learners aware of the broad range of products, within the interactive media discipline. So I think it's very much about an investigate and research, and that's we'd probably see this more tutor-led. So tutors will probably find some good examples of products. It could be a website, it could be a game, it could be an interface, anything really that's interactive that the student can use and interact with to sort of investigate the features and have a think about how have they made this, I wonder what software they've used to create this, etc. So a range of examples is absolutely fine, and that's definitely encouraged.
Okay, a few questions now from Joe as well. You said teacher gives some examples and students look for more. Can they use the ones the teacher showed them as part of their examples in their work?
Yes, so in the teaching and learning, so if we remember that the teaching and learning of the content, so that must be delivered first, and then students will be given an assignment then, an interactive, an internal assessment task, an assignment, and that's where they'll work independently at that point to actually, to do evidence further review. So it could be that they can refer back to examples that they previously looked at, but it would be probably best practice because they'll be working to a brief and a scenario. If you remember, David shown us an example that's been put together to use as guidance by NCFE. When learners actually are given an assignment brief, they would be given a vocational scenario. So it may be the case that those examples they've already looked at in their classwork, if you like, won't be relevant. They may well be relevant and there's no reason they can't use them, but what they wouldn't do is be submitting the classwork. They would still have to use that example, but within the time spent allocated for that internal assessment task, if that makes sense. So we wouldn't be submitting the classwork already produced. They'd still be having time to actually work on an independent internal assessment task.
Okay, another one from Joe here. For health and safety, would it be asking too much for them to be looking at health and safety laws?
I think at this level, I think it's always good in the content when, you know, when you're sort of delivering the mandatory content here. I think it's always a good idea for level 2 learners to be aware of, you know, sort of rules, regulations, laws, legislation, etc. That's probably more of a level 3, but, you know, definitely to make sure that they're aware of this is definitely good practice, but it's not part of the assessment criteria.
And one final one then, for the grading of Learning Objective 1, do they need to explain links for all the main assessment points?
They would need to make, and it's not for, so they don't have to, it's holistic. So what we would be looking for is holistically that there are some links. So as long as they've got a link, they've sort of talked about, so if you remember, they have to for a minimum of pass, they have to describe each of those assessment points. Then what we'd be looking for is some links. So each assessment point has a link at some point. So it wouldn't be they have to, you know, make a link between every variation. So we'd like to see some link between, so they've made a link between features and target audience. It wouldn't be sort of all those fine-tuned examples that we gave in the EGs. So yes, there needs to be some link between all of those assessment points, but it can be quite loose. You know, we're looking for this holistically.
Okay, thank you for that, Leslie. That's all the questions at the minute, so I'll let you crack on with Learning Outcome 2.
Okay. And we will come back to the other question on Learning Outcome 2 if it's not answered to here. And again, I'm aware that sometimes there is some overlap as well. When you're thinking as an assessor, as a teacher, you're delivering the content, and there is always some overlap between the learning outcomes, and that's absolutely fine. So we'll move on to Learning Outcome 2. So this learning outcome, I'm just going to move the slide. Do I have control, David, or do you?
You should have control. I'll just mute myself again, and you should be able to have control.
Okay, so Learning Outcome 2, experiment with interactive media products and their production in relation to a brief. So quite a long learning outcome there. But the main point here is to take away is that this is the practical application. So this is the part that learners most enjoy, I would say. And, you know, this is probably one of the, when we're thinking about allocating time for the internal assessment, more time is usually spent for this, allocated for this. So Learning Outcome 1 is very much investigate, and then this is allocate sufficient time for learners to be able to experiment. And what they need to demonstrate within their evidence for this learning outcome is experimentation of processes and techniques needed for the development of an interactive media product. So that is needed, that's mandatory for level 1 and for level 2. And then we've got experimentation with software at level 2 only, and experimentation with hardware at level 2 only. So there is an increase in the demand of the evidence that we're looking for at level 2. So Learning Outcome 2 is about applying what learners have found out in Learning Outcome 1 to experiment with a range of techniques. Now, the important thing is here that it must be in response to a given brief. So this is where it wouldn't be appropriate for a series of sort of classwork to be submitted here. So learners must be given a brief to respond to. Again, it's up to centres how they wish to deliver and assess this content. The most logical approach would be to allow learners to do this in a series of workshops. And again, a range of broad resources as much as possible is best practice. Again, we do realise the limitations that centres have, not just remote, sometimes they might have limited resources actually in their centres as well, and also limited expertise of staff. So as broad a range as you can achieve is best practice. And then also just to reiterate again, this, you know, they must be focusing on meeting a brief. So they must be given a brief, a valid scenario to respond to. And this really gives them some purpose to work to, rather than just sort of going in on blank canvases and experimenting. It really does give them a purpose to experiment these different interactive media processes. And again, some further guidance taken from the unit specification here of what should be taught within the teaching and learning delivery. So evidence of experimenting with hardware. This can be also part of the evidence of experimenting with software solution because there is a valid overlap here. So in the normal sort of world of work practice, you know, students might not really separate experimenting with hardware separate to experimenting with software. They're sort of twofold. So, you know, that's fine. If that evidence crosses over there, that's no problem. So, for example, they may use a digital camera or a mobile phone to capture an image and then import this into some image manipulation software, you know, and the evidence of that process can be captured together, and that's absolutely fine. So some examples here: learners undertaking experimentation. There's a broader range of tools and processes that's available to them. Software solutions, you know, this could be things like Photoshop, it could be Fireworks, it could be some free software, and they all, you know, as well as multimedia authoring software as well. So it could be creating an app, it could be creating a web page. They also might want to start to look at some video editing and animation software when they may want to look a bit further about creating their own assets for their product, and that's good as well. So as much as resources, broad range of resources that we can provide is best practice here. And the learners will produce an interactive media portfolio to combine all of this evidence to show their experimentation. And sometimes blogs are quite useful for these. Students quite like working in blogs, so they can sort of keep a bit of a diary as they go along, so they can put some screenshots or some photographs and write some notes. Some learners like to use production diaries. Some learners like to use capture it even in a Word document as they go along. So it's a sort of a diary process. And PowerPoint is another way as well that this level of learner seems to really respond well to, is actually collating all of this practical evidence within a PowerPoint presentation. And it doesn't by any means need to be presented at the end. It's just used as a resource to capture that. So here we can see the level 2 grading criteria, and again, this purposeful and focused are keywords between the pass and merit criteria here, and this really is making sure that the students are focused and it's purposeful based on their interpretation of the information that's given to them on that design brief. So this is why that brief is really important. So, for example, they will use the given brief to plan their own experimentation in response to a theme. The brief that they're provided with should also include a target audience as outlined in the initial research and learning outcome 1. So pass level should show some links to the brief. Merit, they would have a wider range of evidence that responds to the brief, and distinction would be thorough experimentation with clear links to the brief here. And a good way to do this is annotations of screenshots, and if those annotations are really sort of communicating that they've used that brief within their experimentation, this is where the higher end criteria can be achieved, because they're consistently making decisions in response to a brief. And then here we can see the level 1 assessment criteria. Again, there is still focus on meeting the brief, so it's absolutely vital that they're given a good brief, you know, and it's appropriate to the level, and there is information in there in that brief for them to respond to, even at level 1. So we'd be looking at level 1 for a pass, some basic experimentation on one aspect of the brief. So one aspect of the brief could be a colour scheme that they're given to work to. It could be a particular amount. You know, it might be a client saying they want a holding page. It might be saying I want 2 or 3 pages. It could be a presentation even. You know, it could be an interactive presentation. So we'd be looking for one aspect of the brief with some basic experimentation for a pass. For a merit, there would be 2 aspects. So then they could be looking at, again, it could be a theme and a colour scheme. or it could be the colour scheme and the target audience. So that would need to be clear. And again, it could be that the student annotates to show their understanding of these aspects of the brief, and that could be very simple. It could be saying, I've chosen these colours to meet the target audience. You know, it could be very simple bullet points, very basic annotation. And then at distinction, we've got carries out experimentation with some links to ideas of the brief. So you'd be looking for more than 2 here. So we've got, it's quantified as 1 aspect, 2 aspects. And for distinction, we'd be looking for a more overall holistic response that meets the brief. And there's no additional guidance here, which we usually have in the grading grids. And that's because the centre will devise the brief and there's too much variation for the additional guidance. So hopefully with this 1 aspect or 2 aspects will allow you to make a judgment on how well the students have responded to that brief. And any questions on Learn Outcome 2, David?
Yeah, I'll just start with the one that we had at the beginning. So Learning Outcome 2, can they create a variety of products, or should they just focus on one type of interactive media product?
Because it's a very practical experimentation unit, a range of products is fine. Remember, they don't have to complete a final product. I think that's the main takeaway for Learn Outcome 2, as is time. And lots of centres, we don't state, you know, how you should deliver this unit. Some centres might have learners an hour a week, some might have 2 hours a week, and you know, there's so many variables there. So really, it's about thinking about how much time you've allocated to the particular assignment and what resources you've got, really. So great if they can do a number of experiments, but you know, if you're a little bit more restricted, then that's okay. But I think, you know, try not to focus on just one product that they have to finish is the main idea here.
Okay, another one just for Learning Outcome 2, hardware. In the sample task provided, it does not talk about hardware at all. Also, the previous webinar I have watched on YouTube provided a level 2 distinction example without talking about hardware. Is this new?
No, the hardware element has been in there. Again, so the hardware is not specifically written in the assessment criteria. So although it's part of the content, so if you think about if you're teaching the mandatory unit content, you know, that there's going to have to be some delivery in there, some teaching of actual hardware that the learners are going to have to be able to access and use and know how to use. Even it could be basic setup or basic specifications of what they'd need for the software. But what we don't want is, you know, it doesn't have to be a whole part of the assignment, if you like, just talking about hardware. That's not what we're looking for. It's much more about the practical and the creative application. So, you know, as long as students are able to use it, use the hardware, they don't have to go in a huge amount of detail about, you know, explaining or describing whatever that descriptor is in the distinction or the merit criteria.
Okay, yeah, I was just having a look at the specification for level 2. Yeah, it does mention that, but yeah, as you said, it's not in the grading
content. Yeah,
absolutely.
It's important in the delivery, in the mandatory unit content, but as you find, sometimes all, you know, as with a lot of qualifications, sometimes not all of the content has to be assessed, but it has to be delivered in order for the learner to be able to, you know, to use that hardware to be able to create a product. But it's not, we're not actually assessing them on the sort of descriptions of hardware.
Yeah. Another one here. How much how much experimentation do they need to do with each solution? Could they do an online tutorial and screenshot to show what they made and how they made it?
Yeah, tutorials are fine in the experimentation. That's okay. There's no reason why they can't. It would be good, you know, if they're following a tutorial and then maybe do some adaptions as well. The actual quantity, how many, is a difficult question because, again, this depends on time that's allocated per centre how you actually are going to deliver these internal assessments and resources. I mean, some centres like to deliver the content for Learning Outcome 1 first, and then while that knowledge is fresh in students' minds, they like to give them a small assignment just on Learning Outcome 1. They like to then deliver Learning Outcome 2, series of workshops, and then give them an assignment on Learning Outcome 2, and the same for Learning Outcome 3. Now, that doesn't mean that they're all separate in the they still have the same context, they'll be still working to the same overarching scenario, so there's a purpose there. But that's just one way of delivering, whilst other centres like to deliver all of the content first early on, and then give a little bit more time, or it might be less time depending on the timetable, and they'll just give them one large project brief with maybe some milestones. So they might have a milestone for them to complete research, and another milestone to complete some experimentation, and a milestone for review. So it's really difficult to say how many is most appropriate, unfortunately, unless it specifies in the assessment criteria.
Yeah, this kind of ties in with this a little bit, this next question. With the different ways you mentioned that they can record their experimentation, can we steer them or direct them to use a particular method?
Yes, you can. There's what we don't want. What we don't want is sort of too much tutor interaction, as in, I'm trying to phrase this correctly. So what we need to see is the student's independent response. So we have to be able to authenticate the student work as their own. And I'm not suggesting that anybody would do this, but you know, we want to steer away from anything sort of like templates or gapped handouts that students just respond to in that way. This is much more about giving students a brief and then be able to use their creativity and their knowledge, be able to respond to it in that way, and in a sort of an individual way as well. I don't know if that answers the question.
I'll let you know if he puts in any other comments. If Joe, hopefully that answers your question, Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes.
Ooh, hello, are you still there, Leslie? It might be my audio that suddenly cut out here. Oh, no, you can't hear her either. Okay. I don't know if you've accidentally hit mute there, Leslie. I'll just see if you're still on there. Oh, well, I think you've got control of the mouse there again.
Hi, can you hear me?
Oh, there we go. That's better. Yes, you're back.
I don't know what
There
happened.
we go.
I got an alert saying there was a network connection issue. Did I miss any questions there? I think we got to the end of the questions for Learning Outcome 2.
Well, no, there's a few more actually. There's quite a lot of questions actually for this one. That's okay. Sinead just wants some question about Learning Outcome 1. She just wants to go back there for a minute. Could we again have clarity on whether students can explore websites, apps, games, etc.? In the sample task, it says specifically, you may relate the above to one of the following areas: website, interactive presentation, animation, game, mobile app.
Yes, so the centre can decide whether they include one or they can include more than one.
Another one here from Joe. The evidence of how this has been used to debrief, would that be stating for each one? Sorry, I'll try that again. So the evidence of how this has been used to debrief, would that be stating for each one why they made a particular asset/skill, explaining how it could help them to make something they could use to make what the brief asked for?
I'm not sure I understand the question, because they would only be responding to one brief.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that question myself. Joe, if you could clarify that a little bit.
Yeah, Joe, maybe you're thinking that there is a number of briefs that learners might need to respond to, and they actually only have to be given one internal assessment, and that would include the scenario of the brief. So all of the work that they produce would respond to that brief.
Okay, another one here. Can you add more context to the televised talent show brief? For example, direct them towards a particular type of talent or age group, or should they be coming up with their own details?
You can. The assignments are just examples, and we always encourage centres to adapt them, edit them how they see fit. At the end of the day, you know your learners better than we do, and they are a guideline really. They include assessment tasks that are deemed appropriate for learners to achieve all of that full range of assessment criteria. So by all means, you can add anything, additional information in there if you want to. You can point them in a direction of a particular resource. That's fine as well. So it's important that centres realise that these are just guidelines. Please feel free to adapt them to suit your learner needs.
Okay. Could you recommend how to deliver the content here? So show them examples of, let's say, for example, how to do some video editing, but then when they come to the assessment time, they look at more video editing skills.
Yeah, so most centres, thinking of experience, most centres would deliver these in a series of sort of practical workshops. So when we're talking about the teach and learning here, they might have a tutor demonstration. It also might have some tutorials, but just bear in mind again time. So the content's got to be delivered before learners can actually be given the internal assessment task and actually work independently. So we're not expecting, once all of that content's been delivered, we're not expecting students to demonstrate everything that they've been taught, every technique, within the internal assessment task that they might have to produce maybe a mock-up web page, or they might have to come up with whatever the internal assessment task asks them to do, experiment with creating a menu, for example, or it could be a presentation. And we're not expecting them to sort of cover absolutely everything that they've been taught in learning outcome 2, if that makes sense. So it's very much focusing, getting learners getting used to responding to a brief, so working within constraints, purposeful, making sure that they focus their work, because in reality this is what's preparing them for the external assessment. And the external assessment will draw on all units, if you remember at the start. So it will draw on unit 1, 2, 3 and 4 when they actually come to sit that external assessment paper. So it's really important that all of these content is delivered prior to learners actually being registered for that exam. And what they'll be given in the external assessment is a design brief, and they'll always be given a design brief. And there's some past examples there on the Qual Hub that David demonstrated earlier, and I would definitely recommend you all to take a look at those, because essentially the briefs stay the same for each window. It's just that scenario that will change. So any of the unit content that focuses on learners responding to a brief, that is a real key focus to get them used to doing that independently.
Okay, we have 2 more questions. Time's moving on fairly quickly at the minute. So lots of low ability students would be lost if we didn't give them an idea of record this on a Word document with these main headings, etc. That's from Joe.
Yeah, I understand, Joe, and I don't think there's any problem with you giving them some headings. What we wouldn't want is sort of too many prompts there. So if you gave them headings, and it could be to experimentation of Photoshop, and then another heading, experimentation of Dreamweaver, or whatever it is they might be using, that's fine. If that's what you mean, that's no problem. What they can't have, really important, if you use any guidance such as that and give them some sort of guidance of how to lay out their document, which is okay to an extent, as long as we can verify that it's the student's own work and they're not sort of just completing sort of gapped handouts from staff or too much tutor driven. That's not permitted in the external assessment. So what I would be cautious with is when students come to do the external assessments that they are aware that they won't be given, they are going to be on their own to respond. So they're not going to be given that sort of tutor guidance, if that makes sense.
You mean the internal assessment?
When they come to the external assessments, they're not allowed to be given any sort of tutor prompts, in their evidence, because it's an invigilated assessment paper. Yeah. So if you do give them any sort of guidance how to lay out their evidence for maybe a PowerPoint or a Word document for the internal assessment, that they won't have that source when they come to the external assessment, because that's obviously not permitted.
Okay. Two more questions. One from Sinead here. So if they were to make a video or theme tune, does it need to be completely finished?
No, it doesn't. No, it's just experimentation, this unit.
Joe, then, so how much content do we cover, for example, video editing? So that's my point. How much do we leave up to them to experiment with during the assessment time? Or would they just be doing using the 1 or 2 video editing skills we teach them, but in relation to the brief?
Yes, so they'll only be expected to use the skills that they've been taught, and not every centre will teach video editing as well. It's worth pointing out as well. So it's not a video editing unit. So please don't think you've got to go and go and you might know some assessors will know how to use video editing software, some will not, and they won't even use it at all in the specification. And it doesn't mean that they can't complete the whole qualification without video editing, because they can. So use the resources that are available to you, but also what your students want to create. They may want to create a website, but it doesn't have to contain video. Does that make sense? So they'll only be able to respond in the internal assessment task with what they know.
Yeah, Joe said that he gets that. Just used video editing as an example.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. I'll let you move on then to learning outcome 3.
Okay. Okay, so learning outcome 3. So this is the review part of the unit. And this is where learners will review their experimentation with interactive media products. So at level 1, there is 2 bullet points that they must evaluate, and that's the use of processes and techniques, and also strengths and weaknesses. So quite straightforward there for level 1. And at level 2, the demand's higher. So here, and this is where it sort of changes, because there's more content, if you like, there's more elements that they must cover in the review, but they actually just need to consider. So the learner must consider selection of processes and techniques, use of software, feedback, and skills development. So there's a little bit of difference between level 1 and level 2 in the reviews. And again, just to emphasise that it's a consideration. So we're not looking for a great deal of detail in the evaluation of all of those 4 areas at level 2. And then just a point on feedback, which is that 3rd bullet point. Feedback could include a teacher, it could include a particular audience they might present to, it could include their peers, it could include a client or a guest speaker. So it's quite flexible on feedback as well. And some students like to do it, they might like to ask their peers some little questionnaires, some surveys, but also they might like to do like an online survey as well, where they sort of have likes and dislikes. Again, there's many different ways, and we wouldn't sort of tell you the right or wrong way to do, but they do have to evidence some sort of feedback there. So looking at the level 2 assessment criteria, so quite straightforward. And again, we're looking for describe, pass, merit and distinction. So the learning outcome again requires consideration. And we can see how, so the describe the experimentation involved and identifies some aspects of what went well and not so well. And I think that's probably quite straightforward for learners to do. I think they're probably quite used to doing this type of review and evaluation at this level. And then we've got merit, describe the experimentation involved, and identifies what went well and not so well. And again, it's quite a little bit of difference, but we're only looking for some aspects for a pass. But what they must do, and what the key difference is here at distinction, they can't achieve a distinction if they don't include the opportunities for improvement. So that must be there. And sometimes we see this evidence as part of the annotated screenshots or that production diary or a blog. Those evidence formats that we talked about for Learning Outcome 2, it's absolutely fine for this evidence for Learning Outcome 3 to be part of that. So if the students are making some valid review comments as they're creating, as they're experimenting, and they're sort of identifying, you know, I've done this particularly well, or I haven't done this so well, you know, if those type of annotations are in there, evidence, that's fine. That evidence can be assessed here as well. It doesn't have to be a separate evaluation at the end of the unit or a separate evaluation in any form. But what we will require for a distinction learner is to see those improvements. So if they are sort of evidencing it as they go along, please do make sure that the assignment, the internal assessment task, asks them to make sure that they're also commenting on what they could improve, just to make sure that they target that higher end distinction criteria as well. And then level 1 assessment criteria, again, quite straightforward, and here we're just looking for an outline. Again, so this could be, some lists, it could be some bullets, it could be some very basic notes if we're using the approach of learners annotating their experimentation. You know, so we're looking at outline of what's happened, what they've done, and then the only difference here, in addition to the outline, would be some sort of overall conclusion. You know, it could be whether they think that they've met the brief, or whether they've done well or they haven't done well. So I realise I've probably whizzed through those learning outcomes probably in a little bit more time than we probably usually do, because we've usually got to look at the learner work now at this stage. Is there any questions, David, that have come in at the moment before we look at some samples? And I think once you start to look at the examples of learner work, some of this actually makes a little bit more sense.
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions. Some actually I'm able to answer as well. But the first one, Learning Outcome 3, can they combine Learning Outcome 2 and Learning Outcome 3 together? Yes,
they can. So as long as we can see where the evidence is, that's fine. And it makes sense.
This other one here, any suggestions of allowing this feedback to happen remotely? Sinead, you definitely can allow it to happen remotely. If you go onto the QualHub subject page, we do have the adaptation guidance there. So the feedback can be online feedback like forum comments, email feedback, surveys, so the Survey Monkey type things that's there are some of the options available to you as well.
And learners are quite creative with those type of things as well. They quite like creating them as well. They're really good.
And one other question here, in the teaching part of each learning outcome, could we use a different brief as a teaching tool as we go through? For example, showing how we could experiment to a brief and then give them a different scenario for their actual assessment.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine.
So sort of like setting mock assessments.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Yeah.
That's it then. I'll let you crack on with showing some.
Okay. So I'm just going to remind you as well, so this learner has been given a pass for Learning Outcome 1, pass for Learning Outcome 2, and Learning Outcome 3, also a pass. So remember, they have to pass all 3 learning outcomes to get a pass for the overall unit. So I'm just going to proceed, and I'm going to click through the work, but just remember that you do have this as a PDF to download from the screen here. I think it's in the handout screen. I think that's correct, isn't it, David? And you'll be able to download this and have a look at this in your own time as well. So what this student's done, they've sort of started off with the brief, which is it's informative. So they've told us exactly what they're going to do. So they put that first. And again, you can see here that this is outlined the learning outcomes as well, what they're going to be reviewing. So even though this may have had some titles, if you like, it might be a good example of what we were talking about before, we can still clearly see that the student has actually, you know, it's their own work, if you like. We can see that there is their own responses to some of these titles. So they've started to describe here. And again, just remember, this is only the pass criteria as well. So they've started with the features here in this table. They've started to use some correct terminology. And here they've started actually to review some examples here as well. So the interactive features here. And good practice to start to get them to think about improvements. And this student as well as putting the evidence together in a PowerPoint, they actually keep a learning log as well. So there's been some screenshots here that we put in just to support the other evidence. So they've been keeping a blog as well. So that was for learning outcome 1. So here they're starting to look at different processes. So again, they're you know, they've started to describe and explain within their sort of experimentation and software that they've been using. And here the review is very much within the text as well. So they've started to sort of review whether it's easy to use. They've also said things that they don't like. So that's really good practice as well, to sort of be quite evaluative with their review of the experimentation. And then finally, we've got learn outcome 3. Some feedback examples. And then we'll just move on to distinction work. I think this is a good example of actually showing how they've sort of extracted information from the brief that they've been given. It's a good way to sort of evidence that. They've gone in a bit more detail here. And again, I realise I'm going through this quite quickly. So please do take the time to read the learner's text and annotations in your own time. And there's quite a lot of it as well, quite a lot of evidence. So I think it's important to remind you that this is, you know, it's one example and it's quality rather than quantity that we're looking for. So students don't have to produce, you know, work in this quantity, if you like. They can still achieve the higher criteria if the quality is there, but, you know, it might be in less volume, if you like. So that's quite a lot of evidence there for learning outcome 1. So they've been experimenting with storyboards. So they've covered sound as well as image, web authoring. They've experimented with some video editing. I think this is quite a common approach that learners evidence with this type of, you know, what went well, even better if. They respond quite well to this type of approach. And this student's done it in quite detail for the different processes that they've experimented with. And how they've used feedback. So they've conducted a survey here. And they've sort of collated some of the comments as well. So that sort of brings us to the end of that distinction. Again, please don't be too concerned about the amount. I realise both students, pass and distinction, have produced quite a lot of work there, and that they do have a blog as well, a learning blog that they keep alongside. But these are just examples to show you the different ways that students can evidence the work for this unit. So again, just bear in mind that that's not the only approach.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Leslie. I'm just going to launch this poll that, again, the one that I asked at the start, how confident you are feeling, how confident you feel now. And while that poll is going on, I'm just going to address some of the questions that have come in. There's a few actually I'll be able to answer straight away. For example, sorry, this has already been asked, don't be sorry at all. Are the students allowed to complete assessment tasks remotely? Absolutely they are, yes. I mean, they have to at the minute, certainly. So on the Interactive Media Qual Hub page, we actually have a tab that says Adaptations. In there, it does give some additional guidance and advice around how to help and support learners to complete those at home as well. Another question here from Joe. Again, this is one that I should be able to answer. Given this September will be the last that students can start the course to qualify in 2 years' time before the accreditation of the course expires, is there any news on the future of the qualification or an extension of the accreditation? Joe, we are currently working on deployment of a new interactive media v-cert that will meet the new criteria, and we intend to launch that, assuming everything gets passed and so on and ticked, for first teaching in September 2022. So that'll be ready for the 2024 performance tables. So I'd imagine from September next academic year, we will have more information regarding that new interactive media v-cert out and about to give you information about what it's like, how it's run, and so on. Let's have a look here. I think the rest of the students the rest of the questions are probably for you, although I think an answer to this one is yes. Can we show this exemplar work to our students?
I don't see why they can't. Do you, David? I don't.
No. I mean, it's something sorry, go on.
I don't think we have any anything against that. I don't see why it would be an issue.
No, not at all. The only thing to be wary of course, is plagiarism. But the way I've used this sort of material before in my teaching is I'd give them some pieces of work and I've asked them to evaluate it themselves. You know, what's good about this? What's bad? What would you add to it? Or what went well and even better if it. So it's quite useful from that standpoint as well. Let's see. 2 final questions it looks like here, and I hope I haven't missed anyone. Oh, sorry, I was about to miss a question. A question about the learning outcome 3. The distinction criteria part of what they could improve. Is this what skills and processes they could improve or do better next time? For example, really struggled to create website navigation buttons. Or is it how they could have related their experimentation more to the brief scenario?
It can be any improvements, so it's quite flexible. So any improvements regarding the experimentation as a whole. So it could be based on skill development, or it could be how they produce something that maybe didn't quite meet the brief. So in both areas.
Okay. This one, I'm going to spell this program. It doesn't sound right saying the name. Would you recommend experimenting with more than one type of software for various processes and techniques, like Photoshop versus GIMP? Or is it enough to show a variety of software if just using one, like Photoshop, but then also using editing, but also editing audio, etc.?
Yeah, I think that again, I don't want to sort of say, you know, I have to be careful and say the best way to do it is this, because, you know, there is no sort of best way. In my experience, to give learners a more broad access to resources, I think, you know, and again, it's much more of my opinion here. If rather than having learners to compare to image manipulation software, it might be better to allow learners to use an audio software and an image manipulation software. That way they're getting a broader experience using 2 different software applications, and also that way they're able to be able to create assets in sound as well as video, as well as images, if you like, editing images. So it's also preparing them to prepare those assets when they come to Unit 3, when they're actually creating their own product. So I wouldn't really get tied up on comparing which is the better image manipulation software. I don't think it needs to go into that depth for this. The real focus here is giving students access to as much creative application as they can to help them create their own products.
Okay. Just 2 more questions, I think. One of them, this one's probably more so for me. It's not related to Unit 1. My students were supposed to sit the exam this January, but got pulled off the exam timetable due to the logistics and the amount of students that wanted to actually take it. How would you want us to do the external assessment? Okay, this is not something we can even answer for you right now. At the minute, Ofqual are in the middle of their consultation process regarding what approach to take for vocational and technical qualifications. That consultation ends tomorrow, so this Friday the 29th. We are hoping to have the results of that consultation back to us at some point in February. At that point, then we'll have an answer with regards to how the rest of the year actually goes. As for now, there's no other advice. It's out of our hands until we know what's happening, DFE wise, off-call wise, and so on. So apologies, I'm not able to help you anymore with that question. Just to follow up, it looks like from Joe regarding the 2 programs. I think that question was, should they experiment with 2 different software for the same thing? Not to compare, but to have a broad range of tools available.
Yeah, they can, but again, I'd just be conscious of how much time that they're spending on just one sort of, similar software packages. It might be best to allow them to do some authoring, do some actual, maybe some video editing, some animation, as well as, because one software package is enough, I think, to practice image editing, to give them the experience and the skills to be able to prepare those type of assets for additional, when they start to come into units 2 and 3, and the external assessment as well. But by all means, if that's something that you want to do, again, we wouldn't sort of dictate to how to deliver. The content is there. That's the mandatory content, that we consider students need to know before that external assessment is undertaken. And it's also I wanted to say as well, I don't think I touched on it before, is to make sure that that everybody accesses the knowledge and the experience of their external quality assurer. Please don't think that they're not approachable and that you can't ask them questions regarding the specification, any issues or concerns you've got with the units when you're delivering them. Any type of questions. There's no such thing as a silly question, so please use the contact and communicate with your external quality assurer, because they're always happy to help with the internal assessed units. Sometimes they're not all examiners, so they don't all have the knowledge and understanding of the external assessment in depth, but some of them indeed are examiners, but they would be reluctant to talk about that anyway. But definitely for the internal assessment units, please make sure that you access their knowledge and keep in contact with them, because they can answer many of your questions that are subject to specific to your centre.
Okay, I think just one more question to look at now. The adaptations for the exam are great news. The adaptations for the internet units, not so much. The exam board approaches the assessment criteria is broad enough for students to still complete units. I have some students who are not engaging at all with remote learning. Is there any advice on what to do for these students? Joe, I'm going to give you sort of 2 lines here. The first one is just government guidance, which is regarding that the government guidance is that centres are expected to promote engagement in education. So technically it's not something that we would advise on. That's sort of an official line, I suppose, if you like, from government guidance. I'm happy to offer some suggestions though. One thing that I would suggest with regards to the completing of the assignments, maybe set mini deadlines, have something that you need to view from them every week. I mean, you don't have to give them any feedback or anything like that at that stage, just so you can check in and see how much they've done, and then send them reminders, right? You should have had a lot more done than this, and so on, things like that. Perhaps if your centre is still issuing out homeworks, could you make the homeworks more about the interactive media stuff to get them caught up, or suspend homework for a period of time? Obviously engage with parents as well, even put together maybe a parental guide to disqualification, how 60% of their grade comes from the external assessments, or excuse me, from the internal assessments. 60% of the grade comes from the internal assessment. Share those mini deadlines with the parents so that they'd be able to look at little Tommy's work and find out, Tommy, you have to have this deadline in. Have you done that? Possibly one-to-one tutorials. I don't know if you're currently delivering live lessons. I know not all centres are, but maybe setting up times for one-to-one tutorials with the learners, so you can actually speak to them one-on-one through whatever online remote means you're doing. to check in, see how they're doing. And if there's some that really aren't engaging, I don't know if your centre is able to take some of those off their timetable for a half day or full day or things like that. There are some suggestions that I can just make at the moment. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Leslie, but it's a bit hard to advise on that one, really.
It is. It's difficult to advise, and every centre's in a different situation, and indeed every learner's at a different stage. And we don't, and I'm sure it's difficult. It's very stressful for teachers and very stressful for learners, and we do sympathise with that. But again, as awards and organisations, it's sort of we're not permitted to sort of advise on the best and the only ways to do these things. But I think everything that David's mentioned there are really good ideas. I mean, some, your students better as well, and some students respond quite well, motivating each other. Sometimes when I don't know if there's any opportunities that they share work together as a group. Sometimes that can be as motivation to see what other students have achieved and what they've done, especially with software as well. I think it'd be quite nice to sort of make sure that they're sharing work and and put it over to the students. They can talk about what they did, how they've achieved a certain outcome, maybe using some software, things like that. Try and keep it as practical and as engaging as you can. And I know it's difficult if they don't have access to the software as well. So again, these are just ideas, really.
Yeah. I know Joe just added to that. It is a difficult time for all. That he has been actually setting the mini deadlines, but not always getting responses. Calling home, but not getting any answers. I understand these difficulties. I mean, I can't really advise you any more than that. I don't know if there's someone I know that in one school I worked in, there was someone who would specifically go around and knock on learners' doors if they were missing time and things like that. Heads a year, I don't know if they might have more contact with them. Again, I know it's a difficult time. Sinead has added to this as well. I have one student who is writing this all by hand. How are they meant to assess learning objective 2? Specific techniques. I know ideally the school will provide the tech, but should we log this when it comes to the assessment? You can make a note of this, definitely. But one of the things is that get onto the government scheme, because there is a government scheme where they're meant to be providing learners with access to laptops and so on, IT devices. I know that there are.
You can use free software as well if it's the issue of the software, because I know this, software is very expensive as well, and I think this is one particular qual where it does struggle with software. But there's no reason, particularly for this unit, it's experiment, so they might be able to, because provided they've got a specification on a laptop, when I say specification of a computer that they can run it, but they might be able to access, the free trials that are just for short term. That might be something to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was taking it from the approach that they may not have any IT access, but of course it might just be the software. But yeah, there's definitely the government scheme. If they don't have any computer whatsoever, then there is the government schemes for getting laptops. BBC give a laptop, I think is what it's called. They list a lot of organisations who are actually giving laptops and IT equipment to learners as well. And failing that, the government have confirmed that learners without any laptops are actually allowed into centres. And no, that's not something we would want. We want to try and avoid learners being in centres, but there's some of the other options are still available. Oh, yes.
Yeah, definitely keep a log of, because when we do know more after the consultation, any sort of further adaptations or mitigations or special considerations, as long as, it might be the case where as long as we can see, evidence of that, and by making a log of that, clearly by your student doing the written evidence, and they're trying to, they're still involved, aren't they? They're still actively participating in the learning process. It's just that it's not their fault that they can't engage using the software. So please do make sure that you keep a log of this evidence and the issues that you're having.
I think that's all the questions at the minute. I hope I haven't missed anyone. It certainly seems to be all the questions there. Thank you very much for your time for attending this webinar. I know we've gone on a bit, but I hope you found it useful. If you need any, if you have any questions, you can contact me directly, David Kiernan at ncfe.org.uk, or if I'm unavailable, we do have our general email, curriculum@ncfe.org.uk. If you do, make sure before you leave, grab the handouts where there's the PDF of this slides and so on. So do absolutely grab that, showing more of the example learner work. And when you do leave, there is going to be a little evaluation that pops up. Really appreciate your feedback on that. And I want to pass on my very sincere thanks to Leslie for everything you've done for this webinar as well. So if there's no other questions, there doesn't seem to be, please do enjoy the rest of your evening, and thank you very much.
Thanks everyone. Have a good evening.
Thanks now. Bye.